which is basically saying it's a hysteria. What's happened? Manufactured by the Kamloops Band to extract transfers of the government, enabled by journalists who are not doing their jobs, and a virtue signaling government that was holding teddy bears over graves, those were graves at Cowessess.
Today, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, Frontier Center for Public Policy, and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship are putting forth a debate panel titled "Does Wokeism Threaten Academic Freedom?" at the Lethbridge Public Library. Wokeism is a form of identity politics stemming from liberal progressive ideologies, which has become a common trend in the younger generation, especially within the settings of schools and universities. A herd mentality, you could say. The debate is being hosted by Jonah Pickle, a neuroscience student at the University of Lethbridge, Paul Viminitz, a philosophy professor at the University of Lethbridge, and Frances Widdowson, a formerly tenured professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies. You may remember Frances Widdowson, a former professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, who made headlines for speaking out against Black Lives Matter and further expressing her views on educational benefits of residential schools. She had mentioned that Black Lives Matter had destroyed the university and that children in residential schools got an education they otherwise would not have received. Despite everything we saw in the mainstream media, the unmarked graves were unsubstantiated claims. Rebel News reporter Drea Humphrey did a documentary breaking everything down. You can visit kamloopsdocumentary.com to watch it. As a result, more than 6,000 people had signed a petition to remove her from her position, and after review from the university, they had proceeded to fire her. In February of 2023, Frances was set to speak on the topic of wokeism at the University of Lethbridge, but the event was cancelled due to controversy, and she went there regardless, only to be greeted and shouted down by protesters. The protesters can be seen wearing orange and Child Lives Matter merchandise in solidarity with the First Nations children and the unmarked graves.
And that starts today with the call to all levels of government to fully fund the search of residential school sites to bring the children home.
Freedom of speech in schools is facing growing threats. While schools have historically been places for open discourse and the exchange of diverse ideas, there has been an increasing tendency to stifle this freedom. Examples include strict censorship of controversial topics, punitive actions against students and teachers for expressing dissenting views, and limitations on what can be discussed in classrooms. Such restrictions not only hinder the development of critical thinking skills, but also infringe upon the fundamental right to free expression, which is essential for a healthy and democratic society. Balancing the need for a safe and respectful learning environment with the preservation of free speech remains an ongoing challenge.
I guess the question that comes to my mind is, where do you draw the line between freedom of speech and hate speech?
So criticism of Judaism is a very sensitive area in the academy, and if you criticize certain aspects of Judaism as a religion, that's not hate speech, because you're not demanding that anything be done to anyone. You're just raising a question, and if you make that illegal, then this is going to be a problem. I think that's very dangerous when we get into prohibiting those forms of speech, because then it becomes, well, like people are arguing in my case, when I don't think that the residential schools were genocidal, that I am somehow opening up Indigenous groups to detestation and vilification. When it's nothing at all. I think that Indigenous people have the rights to all the access to resources that everyone else has. They should have access to education, clean water. They should be able to thrive. I just am disputing facts that are being put forward. But it's being interpreted that way by some people, and if we get Supreme Court judges that think that way too, that means we're not going to be able to discuss the nature of the residential school system. So I think this is a very, very thorny area which needs a lot of discussion.
So you were saying that at the university, that with some teachers or with some profs, it's not possible for a student to get an A regardless of the academic merit of their work. So Who are they? Which ones?
This is what has been reported to me from other students. Luckily, I haven't had to take any of these courses, but my girlfriend is one of the people who has had to take these courses, and she took a Women and Gender Studies course under the person that Frances has been naming, Dr. House.
So it's possible to verify what you said some other way, but you can't say it here. Is that right?
You said it.
So which teacher was it?
Carolyn Oates.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
but I haven't taken any courses underneath her. This is just what's being reported to me from students, is that the dominant strategy, that if you want to do well in these classes, is that you have to agree with the teacher, but maybe not so much agree with the teacher, but prove that you understand their interpretation of the world, and that you can look at an event and interpret it in the way that they want you.
I'd just like to announce that I am in fact Jonah's professor in the class right now, and I just want to make a public assurance he will not be getting an A from me.
But just to turn the question around to you, why should I not be able to make the presentation that I made today at the University of Lethbridge? Why do we have to come to the Lethbridge Public Library to have a discussion about these ideas?
I would call that a separate issue. I was wanting to know why you feel that you can't discover the truth of an issue with normal research methodology if you can't speak at the university.
Because I'm deprived of the intellectual interaction,
The input from other people.
the input that I could obtain from the University of Lethbridge people, which President Mann, because he is a coward and a spineless clown, will not allow happen at the University of Lethbridge.
You were proposing that the genocide is false because there isn't proof of 250 bodies at Kamloops, and I'm wondering how that's a reasonable equivalency. Like, is it you don't? Well, that's its own thing. But I also was curious if you don't believe in ground penetrating radar, and so that's why you think that's not true. But I'm just wondering about that equivalency because you read the statement or you showed the statement of I can't remember who it was.
So there's two separate arguments. The first one is, are there 215 bodies buried in the Kamloops apple orchard? That's the first argument. It is highly improbable that there are 215 bodies buried there because we have no parent saying that their child went missing. As well, if you read my piece, Billy Remembers, which is basically saying it's a hysteria, what's happened, manufactured by the Kamloops band to extract transfers of the government, enabled by journalists who are not doing their jobs, and a virtue signaling government that was holding teddy bears over graves, those were graves at Cowessess. They were part of a cemetery where the crosses blew away. No one should be surprised to find human remains in a cemetery. That's not a surprise, but it was it was insinuated that that was some kind of mass grave of clandestine burials. So that's that issue. There are many arguments that I make about that in my piece, Billy Remembers. So I highly recommend that because it's done on the research of Nina Green. Nina Green is one of the most fantastic researchers on the Indian residential school question, and I used her research to write that piece. The second argument, which is related but distinct, is the question of whether the residential schools were genocidal. And on this argument, I follow the most well-known researcher on the residential schools in Canada, J.R. Miller, who has written the most on the subject, and I agree with him that the residential schools were not genocidal because they were intended to assimilate the Indigenous population. And if you want to assimilate a group, and the reason why there was an attempt to assimilate the Indigenous population was because it was believed at the time, rightly or wrongly, that Indigenous people had to acquire the attributes of what they called at the time the white man's world to be able to survive, because the fur trade had collapsed and they would not be able to sustain themselves. That was the thought process, which is not genocidal. We are claiming now, because of all the restrictions on discussion, that the Holocaust that intentionally exterminated millions of people is equivalent or somehow similar to the residential school system. This is absurd. It's a ridiculous argument, and I would follow J.R. Miller on the claim about genocide. But the reason why people want, and they do want it, like why would you want to find 215 murdered children? It's wanted to find that because that buttresses the argument about genocide. That's why people want to find that, and that's why the indigenous neo-tribal elites, not the ordinary indigenous people, and their lawyer brokers, people like Tony Merchant, who've made hundreds of millions of dollars, siphoning money away from much needed services in indigenous communities. That's why the lawyers are so interested in trying to do this and manufacture all sorts of arguments about it.
I think that wokeism is calling for the censorship of ideas which dissent it, and this is affecting our ability to speak in the classroom and engage with ideas with what the administration disagrees with.
As an outspoken student at the University of Lethbridge, what has the response been from fellow teachers and students?
Not as many students are as interested in this as I would want to see. I just think students don't understand what they have to lose by not fighting against this. And I also think that life as a student is busy, and there's other things to be concerned about.
And obviously there are, it's hard to speak out in universities your opinions because there's the fear of being shamed or frowned upon. So what would you say to those students who are afraid, who haven't gained that courage yet to speak out? What advice would you give to them?
You don't know how much better you could make things by simply speaking your mind. Don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe, regardless of what you think the consequences are, because you might turn out to be wrong, and things could turn out better for you than you expect.
Wokeism, my definition, is identity politics that has become totalitarian, and totalitarianism prevents a wide range of ideas from being discussed. And you need to have that wide range of ideas being discussed to have academic freedom in a university.
What has the response been from students or professors around Alberta, specifically Mount Royal or the University of Lethbridge, to your political opinions of being politically incorrect?
Well, the cancellation probably is the most. There's many professors at the University of Lethbridge who think it's perfectly acceptable for another professor to be prevented from speaking if they disagree with their ideas. But there's a lot of support. I have a lot of support as well. So what I'm trying to do is just develop organizational strength to help those professors and students who think that the university should be an academic institution.
And we see that you're suing the University of Lethbridge for canceling the event that you previously had, which was to talk on the topic that we had today. Can you give us some updates on that and some insight?
Yes, so this is all going ahead. We're putting in the court documents of various kinds. I believe the court date when it does go to court eventually is going to be 2025, but there's a lot of groundwork that has to be done before that time. And as well, we want to raise public awareness about this problem, so we're hoping to have similar events in other cities which have universities to get the discussion going about this very, very serious problem that's facing universities.
What advice can you give to students or professors that are holding back, saying their views for the fear of being canceled?
Well, I think they need to join with other professors and students, and that's my hope, is to develop local chapters of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship in various university campuses, so then people can become part of an organization which will give them strength, give them support, and enable them to come together with other professors and students to fight for what they think public universities should be all about.
And do you see hope in that? Do you think that there's going to be change?
I think it's going to be a very, very long and hard fight. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think that's the only way. And if we do care about our public institutions, which I think universities are incredibly important institutions, we will find the strength and energy to be able to fight for what we think is right.
Well, I thought the discussion was productive, but the fact that the president of the university wasn't here, that the faculty members who complained about Frances Widdowson weren't here, it was very disappointing and cowardly, I would say, and showing a disrespect for the whole need for discussion about something so basic to a university as the ability to speak freely about what you think, and the academic freedom, which is a different concept, with speaking with expertise, people who have gone through the system. I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of Lethbridge. I mean, I look at the University of Lethbridge and it sort of seems like a bit of a wasteland right now. So the failure of the university administration, their will to hide, the just failure to engage these central questions of our time, because look at what we're living through. Look at what, what happened with the universities. No real discussion on the mandates. Are the universities now, you just cozy up to the administration and you get ahead? And if you're independent thinking and critical thinking, there's no place for you at a university. This is what we're seeing. And so in a way, this just confirms there's something really wrong at the University of Lethbridge. And it's not only the University of Lethbridge, but the University of Lethbridge is getting a reputation as an enemy of academic freedom and free speech. And that is not a good reputation for a university.
Rebel News is going to continue to follow the case of Frances Widdowson alongside her lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, who are taking to court the University of Lethbridge after stopping Frances from speaking at the university when attempting to bring forth open discussion on free speech at school campuses. It seems like public health officials are talking about bringing masks back again. So if you say no to that, make sure to head to nomoremasks.com and sign the petition.